There is a particular hour of the night that almost everyone knows, even if no one likes to talk about it. It is the hour when the house has gone quiet, when the people you love are finally asleep, when the noise of the day has burned itself out, and yet your mind refuses to rest. You lie there in the dark with your eyes open, staring at a ceiling you cannot even see, and somewhere deep inside you a long list begins to unroll. The things you forgot to do, the conversation that went wrong, the bill that is coming, the person who pulled away, the future you cannot control no matter how hard you try. And in that hour you are not lazy and you are not weak. You are simply tired in a way that sleep does not seem to reach. Tired in the place where the soul lives, because you have been carrying something far too heavy for far too long, and a part of you is beginning to wonder how much longer you can hold it. If you know that hour, then this story was made for you. So before we go any further, let me invite you to do something simple. Let your shoulders fall a little. Unclench the hands you did not even realize you were clenching. Breathe slower than you usually allow yourself to breathe. Because tonight I want to walk beside you through a journey. And this journey is not made of lectures or rules or things you must fix about yourself. It is made of 11 small stories, 11 quiet truths handed down through many lifetimes, and each one was kept alive because somewhere along the way it set a weary heart free. We will not rush through them. We will move slowly, the way light moves into a room at dawn, never all at once, but gently, steadily, until the whole space is full. So settle in, wherever you are, and let us begin with the first of these stories, the one about the weight you were never meant to carry. The first story begins with a single honest question, and the question is this: who told you that the world would fall apart if you ever stopped holding it together? Somewhere along the way you came to believe that everything depended on you. You came to believe that if you stopped straining, stopped planning, stopped bracing yourself against every possible disaster, then the ground beneath your life would crack open and swallow everything you love. And so you became the one who holds it all. You hold the worry so that no one else has to. You hold the plans, the schedules, the fragile peace, the unspoken fears, all of it balanced on shoulders that have not had a true rest in years. But here is a thought worth sitting with tonight. The sun has been rising for longer than human memory can reach, and not once has it needed your hands to lift it. The sea has known exactly where its boundaries lie since long before you were born, and it has never once asked you to keep it in place. Even the breath that is moving in and out of your chest at this very moment is a quiet gift given to you again and again without you ever having to ask, without you even having to remember to receive it. So if the great machinery of the world turns without your strength holding it in place, then why have you convinced yourself that you must carry the entire weight of your own life alone? You were not created to live in fear. That is the truth at the center of this first story. You were not made to spend your nights rehearsing every way things could go wrong. And yet, I understand why you do it, because fear feels like protection. It whispers that if you stay alert enough, if you imagine every disaster in advance, then maybe you can stop the disaster from coming. But fear has never actually protected anyone. All it has ever done is steal the peace of the present moment and trade it for a future that has not even arrived. There is an old image that helps here, and it is the image of a gardener. When a gardener walks through the garden with shears in hand, cutting away the withered branches, it can look to the branch like loss. It can look like cruelty, but the gardener is not destroying the tree. The gardener is clearing away what has already died, so that the living wood can grow stronger, so that the fruit can come back richer than before. There are seasons in your life when something old is being shaken loose, when a door is closing, when a season is ending, and everything in you panics because it feels like losing. But what looks like losing is so often only space being cleared. The hand that is taking something away is not an empty hand. It is making room for something better to be placed inside it. And so the invitation of this first story is simple, but it is not easy. Stop looking at every change in your life through eyes filled with panic. Start trusting that even the parts you do not understand are part of a story still being written with care. And from that quiet place of trust, the path leads us naturally into the second story, because trust is one thing when your hands are full, and quite another thing when they are nearly empty. So let me take you now to a different scene entirely, to a time of long drought, to a small house at the edge of a village where a widow is making what she believes will be the last meal of her life. She has a son, and she has almost nothing left to feed him. In her home, there is only a handful of flour at the bottom of a jar and a thin film of oil in the bottom of a jug, barely enough for one small loaf of bread, one final meal, and then she believes there will be nothing left but to wait for the end. And into this moment of complete scarcity comes a stranger, a traveler worn from the road, and he asks her for something almost unthinkable. He asks her to make bread for him first, from the very last of what she has, before she feeds herself and her child. Now think for a moment about what every reasonable voice inside her must have been screaming. Keep it. Keep the last portion. Protect your own. You do not owe a stranger your final meal. And by every measure of human logic, those voices were right. But she does something that reason could never explain. She gives from her emptiness. She takes the last handful of flour and the last drops of oil, and she trusts and she gives first. And in that very act, while her hands are still trembling, a quiet miracle begins. The flour in the jar does not run out. The oil in the jug does not run dry. Day after day through the long famine, there is always just enough, always one more meal, always enough for the next morning, because the giving did not empty her. It opened a door she could never have opened by clutching tighter. This is the heart of the second story, and it is a truth that runs against everything the world teaches us. Miracles rarely begin when life is overflowing and easy and comfortable. Miracles begin in the moment a frightened heart dares to loosen its grip on the very last thing it was most afraid to release. There are doors in your life that will not open, while your hands are clenched around the things you are terrified to lose. Not because you are being punished, but because a closed hand cannot receive. You cannot pour fresh water into a cup that is already clutched shut. And so somewhere in your life, there may be a last handful of flour, something you are holding with white knuckles, because letting go feels like the end. But what if it is not the end at all? What if the very thing you are most afraid to release is the doorway to the provision you have been praying for? The widow did not understand how the oil would keep flowing. She only knew enough to take one trembling step of trust, and the miracle met her there, in the giving, in the letting go. And once you begin to loosen your grip on what you fear to lose, you come face to face with the third story, which is perhaps the hardest of them all, because it is the story about control. Most of us are exhausted not by what we are doing, but by what we are trying to control. We try to control how other people see us. We try to control the words that come out of someone else's mouth. We try to hold together relationships that are already cracking, as though by sheer effort we could keep two people from drifting apart. We try to manage outcomes that were never ours to manage in the first place, and the strain of it leaves us hollow. So let me take you now to a story of a king who faced something far bigger than himself, and what he did with it changed everything. There was once a king whose people were surrounded by an army so vast that when the watchman brought the report, the whole nation began to tremble. There was no clever strategy that could save them. There were not enough soldiers, not enough weapons, not enough time. By every calculation, they were finished, And in that moment, the king did something that no general would advise. He did not call for a war council first. He did not rush to gather his strength and prepare his defenses. Instead, he stood before his frightened people, and he prayed a prayer that is one of the most honest prayers ever spoken. He said, in essence, "We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." He admitted, out loud in front of everyone, that he had run out of answers. And then he simply waited and trusted, and the word that came back to him was almost impossible to believe. The word was this: "The battle is not yours. The battle belongs to someone greater. You will not need to fight this one with your own hands. You will only need to stand still, hold your position, and watch deliverance come." And so the next morning, instead of sending his strongest warriors to the front lines, the king sent singers. He placed people at the front of the army whose only job was to lift their voices in gratitude before the victory had even arrived. They walked toward an impossible enemy with songs in their mouths instead of swords in their hands. And as they sang, confusion fell upon the vast army that had come against them, and a deliverance unfolded that no human plan could have produced. The people who had trembled in fear at sunrise stood in astonishment by sunset, looking at a battlefield they had never even fought across. Here is what this third story is trying to place gently into your heart. There are battles in your life that will never be won by trying harder. There are struggles that do not require you to charge in with more effort, more control, more sleepless nights of strategy. Some battles are won only when you finally stop fighting in your own strength and allow yourself to be still. The world will tell you every single day that you must stay in control, that you must calculate everything, that you must always be 3 steps ahead of disaster, that the moment you relax is the moment everything falls apart. But there is a deeper way, and it is the way of stillness. It is the way of standing your ground without striving, of trusting that the outcome you cannot control is being handled by hands far stronger and far gentler than your own. True peace was never born from your ability to hold everything together. True peace is born the moment you realize that you are the one being held. Now, stillness sounds beautiful when you say it slowly in a quiet room. But stillness becomes far more difficult the moment you cannot see the road ahead, and that is exactly where the fourth story takes us. Because faith is easy to talk about when everything is clear, and the path is lit, and the next 10 steps are obvious. The real test of faith comes in the fog. It comes on the road where you cannot see more than 1 step in front of you, where every instinct in you wants to stop and demand a map before you take another move. We so often tell ourselves that we will rest once we can see how everything turns out. We will relax once we understand the whole plan. We will trust once the future is guaranteed. But think about that for a moment. If you could already see the entire road, if every door were already standing open, if every outcome were already promised in writing, then you would not need faith at all. You would simply be reading the ending. Faith only exists in the space between what you can see and what you are asked to believe. There is a picture from the natural world that captures this better than any argument could. Think of an eagle, one of the great soaring birds, and consider how it actually flies. An eagle does not rise into the sky by gripping the branch tighter. As long as its talons are wrapped around the safety of the branch, it stays exactly where it is, no matter how strong the wind becomes. The eagle only climbs into the heights when it does the one thing that feels most frightening, which is to let go of the branch and open its wings into a wind it cannot see and cannot control. The unseen wind, the very thing it cannot grasp, is the thing that carries it higher than it could ever climb on its own. And you are very much the same. As long as you keep clinging to the old and familiar, simply because letting go feels dangerous, your soul will stay low to the ground, circling the same small territory, never rising into the wider life that is waiting for you. Sometimes you are given only a small amount of light, only enough to see the next single step, and you take that as a sign that something has gone wrong. But it is not a sign of abandonment. It is an invitation. You are being taught to hold a hand instead of clutching at an outcome. You are being taught to walk first and understand later, because understanding so often comes only after the step, never before it. From that quiet courage to walk into the fog, the fifth story rises like wind across open water, because there's a particular kind of fear that does not feel like fog at all. It feels like a storm. Some seasons of life do not gently obscure the road ahead. They roar. The waves climb higher than your head. The sky goes black in the middle of the day, and everything you tried so carefully to keep steady begins to pitch and crack beneath you. So let me take you out onto the water now, into the heart of a storm, because there is an old account of exactly this kind of night, and it has comforted frightened people for a very long time. Imagine your life as a small boat on a vast and open sea. For a while the water is calm, and you grow comfortable, and you begin to believe that you are the one keeping the boat steady. But then the wind turns, the clouds gather and darken, the waves rise up like walls of water and crash down over the sides, and the little boat begins to fill and groan and tilt. And what do you do in that moment? You do what most of us do. You run from side to side, you bail frantically, you grab the ropes and the oars, and you try, with all the strength left in your exhausted arms, to keep the boat from breaking apart by sheer force of will. And the terrible truth is that the harder you fight to control the storm, the more drained you become, until you are certain that you are about to go under. There were others on a sea like this once, seasoned and afraid, convinced they were about to drown. And the one who had been with them all along, who had seemed almost too calm in the chaos, rose up and spoke to the wind and the water with just a few quiet words, and said, "Be still." And the sea that had been raging for hours grew calm in an instant, smooth as glass, as though it had never known a storm at all. Do you see what the fifth story is whispering? What ultimately brought the peace was not the skill of the sailors, and it was not the strength of their arms. What brought the peace was the presence in the boat. As long as that presence was with them, no storm was ever going to have the final word, even when it looked for a while like the storm was winning. And the same is true for you. There may be a storm in your life right now that you cannot calm with all your effort. You have bailed and bailed, and the water keeps rising. But the question was never whether you were strong enough to silence the storm. The question is whether you can remember that you are not alone in the boat. Fear loses its grip, not when we finally manage to control everything, but when a deeper presence fills the space where the fear used to live. It is the way light works in a dark room. You do not have to fight the darkness. You do not have to carry it out piece by piece. You simply let the light in, and the darkness, which never had any real substance of its own, simply fades away. And once the storm outside begins to quiet, the sixth story turns our attention to a storm that is harder to see, because it does not happen out on the water. It happens inside the human heart. This is the story of the walls we build. If you have lived long enough to be tired, then you have lived long enough to be hurt, and being hurt changes the way we carry ourselves. Think about it honestly for a moment. There was a time when you opened your heart to someone, and you were let down. There was a time when you allowed yourself to hope, and the hope was crushed, and the disappointment cut deeper than you ever admitted to anyone. There were nights when you waited and waited for an answer, for a phone call, for a change, for a sign, and all you ever received was silence. And slowly, without ever deciding to do it, you learned to protect yourself. You learned to keep a little distance, to hold a little back, to never give the whole of your heart again, because the whole of your heart is exactly what got broken last time. You may even have learned to smile on the surface while keeping a hidden escape route ready underneath, just in case, because you have promised yourself that you will never be that vulnerable, that exposed, that easy to wound ever again. And here is the gentlest and most important thing the sixth story has to say to you tonight. That fear is understood. It is not foolish, and it is not shameful. Anyone who has been wounded learns to guard the wound. But there is a hidden cost that almost no one warns you about, and it is this. The same walls you build to keep the pain from getting in are the very walls that keep the healing from getting in too. The fortress that protects you from being hurt again also seals you off from being loved again, from being mended again, from being made whole again. You cannot selectively wall off only the bad. When you close the door of your heart to protect yourself from disappointment, you unknowingly close that same door to comfort, to connection, to the quiet repair that your soul is aching for. There is an image that the old craftsman understood, and it speaks directly to this. Think of a potter working with a lump of clay. To anyone watching, the process can look almost violent. The potter presses the clay, pushes against it, reshapes it again and again, and then sets the finished vessel into a fire so hot it would seem certain to destroy it. But the potter is not punishing the clay. The potter is doing the only thing that will turn a shapeless lump into a vessel, strong enough to hold something precious and beautiful enough to be set on a table and used and loved. The pressing is not cruelty. The fire is not the end. The pressing and the fire are how the clay becomes something that lasts. And your wounds, the places where you were pressed too hard and burned by experiences you never asked for, were never proof that you had been abandoned and left to break. So often, they are the very places where you were being shaped into something stronger and more compassionate than you ever could have become without them. The cracks in a broken vessel are not only scars. When the light gets behind them, the cracks become the very places where the light shines through to everyone else. And speaking of being shaped by what looked like ruin, the seventh story carries us into the life of a young man who lost almost everything before he became everything he was meant to be. His name has been remembered for thousands of years, and his story is one of the great reversals in all of human memory. He started out as a favored son, a dreamer, a young man with a future that seemed bright. And then, through a series of betrayals he never deserved, his life collapsed in stages, each one worse than the last. His own brothers turned against him out of jealousy and sold him away. He was carried off to a foreign land where he knew no one. He worked his way up honestly, only to be falsely accused and thrown into a prison, forgotten in the dark, with no trial date and no end in sight. Imagine the nights he must have spent in that cell, replaying every wrong turn, asking whether the dreams of his youth had been nothing but a cruel joke, wondering whether anyone above the prison walls even remembered that he existed. But here is the part of his story that takes your breath away when you finally see it whole. The pit was not the place where his life ended. The prison was not the place where he was abandoned. Both of those dark places were all along the places where he was being prepared. In the slavery, he learned faithfulness in small things. In the prison, he learned patience and humility and wisdom. He was being formed, slowly and invisibly, into the kind of leader who could one day stand second only to a king and guide an entire nation through years of famine, saving countless lives, including, in the end, the very brothers who had betrayed him. And when that day of elevation finally came, it came suddenly, almost in a single morning. He went from the forgotten cell to the highest court in the land faster than anyone could have imagined. But the suddenness of the rise was only possible because of the slowness of the preparation. If he had been lifted up too early, before the pit and the prison had done their quiet work in him, he would not have been ready to carry what was coming. the very delay that felt like punishment, was actually the protection that made his destiny possible. So when you look at your own life and you see only delay, only closed doors, only seasons that did not turn out the way you planned, I want you to hold this seventh story close. What looks like a detour is sometimes the only road that leads where you are truly meant to go. What feels like a season of being overlooked may be a season of being prepared for something your eyes are not yet able to see. The things that wounded you were not signs that you had been forgotten. In hands that know what they are doing, even ashes can become the soil where new beauty grows. And that leads us, very naturally, into the eighth story, because once you begin to believe that your broken places can be redeemed, the next great fear that rises is the fear that you, specifically you, with all your flaws and failures and ordinary smallness, could never be chosen for anything significant at all. We measure worth in such cruel ways. We measure it by strength, by status, by talent, by how easily a person earns the admiration of a crowd. And by those measures, most of us quietly count ourselves out. We look at our weaknesses and decide we are disqualified. But the eighth story exists to tell you that this is not how worth has ever truly been weighed. Consider the ones who were chosen for great things across the long span of history, and notice how unimpressive they looked at the moment they were called. There was a man so afraid of his own voice, so convinced he could not speak well, that when he was first called to lead a people out of slavery, he begged to be excused, certain he was the wrong choice. There was a shepherd boy, the youngest and smallest in his family, left out in the fields to watch the sheep, while his taller and stronger brothers stood proudly in the house. And yet it was that overlooked boy who would one day become the most celebrated king his nation ever knew. There was another man found hiding in fear, threshing grain in a hidden place to keep it from his enemies, and the first words spoken to him called him a mighty warrior, long before he had done a single brave thing, because he was being called not for who he was in that frightened moment, but for who he was about to become. And there was a young person who protested that he was far too young to be entrusted with anything important, and was told gently but firmly not to say he was too young, because age and pedigree were never the point. Do you see the thread running through every one of them? Not one was chosen because he was already strong enough, or impressive enough, or finished enough. Each one was chosen in spite of his weakness, and in many cases precisely through it. There is an old saying that captures the whole mystery, that people look at the outward appearance, but something deeper looks at the heart. So when you disqualify yourself, when you look in the mirror and see only what is lacking, you are using a measuring stick that the great stories have never used. You do not need to become someone else in order to be loved, in order to be useful, in order to matter. You only need a heart willing to say, "Here I am, use what little I have." Do not despise the small beginnings in your life. The smallest of seeds can grow into a tree large enough for the birds of the sky to rest in its branches. A single small flame, no bigger than a candle, can drive the darkness out of an entire room. And the very things you are most ashamed of, the cracks and the failures and the wounds, may turn out to be the exact places where your light shines the brightest to the people who need it most. Now, if there is one thing that wears a tired heart down more than almost anything else, it is the agony of waiting. And that brings us to the ninth story, which is the story of timing. You can believe that you are loved. You can believe that your wounds will be redeemed. You can even believe that you are chosen, and still find yourself worn thin by the simple, grinding question of when. When will the answer come? When will this season finally turn? Why does it seem like everyone around you is moving forward, stepping into the very things you have been praying for, while you remain exactly where you were, waiting in a silence that feels like it might never break? is one of the loneliest places a person can stand, and the ninth story was kept alive precisely for the ones who are standing there right now. The first thing this story wants you to understand is that delay is not the same thing as rejection. They can feel identical from the inside, but they could not be more different in truth. A gardener does not harvest every fruit on the same morning, because not every fruit is ripe at the same time. To pick the fruit too early is to ruin it. The waiting is not the gardener forgetting the tree. The waiting is the gardener honoring the season, and so much of what happens during a season of waiting happens underground, where you cannot see it and cannot feel it, and would swear that nothing is happening at all. Consider the seed. When a seed is planted, it disappears into the dark soil, and for a long time there is nothing to see on the surface. No green shoot, no sign of life, nothing but bare ground. But beneath the surface, in the hidden dark, the most important work is already underway. The roots are reaching down, quietly, patiently, anchoring deep, because the height a plant can reach above the ground is determined by the depth its roots have gone beneath it. A tree that shoots up too fast with shallow roots is the first to fall in a storm. So when you cannot see any change in your life, when the ground looks barren, and you are tempted to dig the whole thing up in frustration, remember that the silence on the surface may simply be the sound of roots going deeper. History is full of people who learned this the hard and beautiful way. There was a man who was promised a son, an entire future, a legacy as countless as the stars, and then was made to wait so long that his body grew old, and every natural hope of becoming a father drained away. By the time the promise finally arrived, it was utterly impossible by any ordinary measure, and that was exactly the point. The promise was not allowed to come while he could still take the credit for it himself. It came at the moment when only wonder remained, so that the gift would be unmistakably a gift. There was a woman who wept year after year in deep grief because she longed for a child and none came, and her waiting felt like a wound that would never close. But the child she eventually held in her arms grew up to become one of the most important voices of his entire generation, and he arrived at precisely the moment he was meant to arrive, not a single year too soon. There was a man asked to build an enormous boat on dry land, in a place that had never seen the kind of rain that was coming, and he labored at it for years, while the people around him mocked him and called him a fool. And yet that patient, ridiculed labor became, in the end, the very thing that carried his family through the flood. And there is one image from the ninth story that I want to leave resting in your heart tonight, because it speaks so tenderly to the long wait. There were those who walked through their seasons of sorrow, scattering seed through their tears, weeping even as they worked the ground, certain that nothing good could come from soil watered only by grief. But the promise spoken over them was that those who sow in tears will one day reap with songs of joy. Your tears in the long nights were never wasted. They did not vanish meaninglessly into the dark. They fell like seed into fields you cannot yet see, and a harvest is being prepared from ground you thought was nothing but loss. The things in your life that look buried are not always dead. Sometimes they are simply being kept, held in trust beneath the surface, until the right season arrives and life breaks through in a way that no one can hold back. But what about the things that truly do feel dead, not merely buried, but finished, gone, past all hope of return? That is the question the 10th story dares to ask, and it dares to answer it too. Because there is a difference between a seed sleeping in the soil and a dream that you have already buried and grieved and given up on entirely. There are parts of every long life that we have quietly written off. A relationship we stopped believing could ever be restored. A calling we abandoned because fear talked us out of it. A version of ourselves, hopeful and alive and unafraid, that we are convinced has died somewhere along the hard road and will never come back. the 10th story walks straight into that graveyard of dead things and speaks a single, almost outrageous word over it, and the word is rise. There is an old vision in which a man is led out into a valley, and the valley is full of bones. Not freshly fallen, but dry bones, bleached by the sun, scattered across the ground as far as the eye can see. It is a picture of total hopelessness, a place where life has not just departed, but departed so long ago that even the memory of it has faded. And the man is asked an almost cruel question: can these bones live again? By every measure of reason, the answer is obviously no. Dry bones do not live, but he is told to speak life over them anyway, to speak hope into a place that has no business hoping. And as he does, something impossible begins. There is a rattling. The bones begin to come together, sinew and flesh appear, and finally breath enters them, and a valley of death becomes a vast company of the living. The lesson is almost too much to take in, but it is this: there is no place so dry, no dream so long dead, no part of your life so far gone that it is beyond the reach of restoration when life is breathed into it again. And lest you think this kind of turnaround belongs only to ancient visions, consider the man who once stood firmly against everything good, who persecuted the very people he would later die defending, who lived in the darkness of his own certainty and pride. He was, by every appearance, the last person on earth who would ever change. And yet a single encounter with a light he could not explain turned the persecutor into one of the most powerful voices for hope the world has ever known. The very passion that had driven him to do harm was not destroyed. It was redeemed and redirected, and it became the engine of a life that lifted millions. This is what the 10th story insists you must not forget. No one is too far gone to be brought back. No heart is too hardened to be made tender again. The very things in you that have gone cold and quiet and seemingly dead can be awakened, and often it is in the deepest silence, not in the thunder and the spectacle, that the awakening begins. There was a weary prophet once who went looking for the voice of the divine in a great and violent wind, and it was not in the wind. He looked in the earthquake, and it was not in the earthquake. He looked in the fire, and it was not in the fire. And then, after all the noise had died away, there came a gentle whisper, soft and low, and that was where the voice had been waiting all along. So, if your life feels silent right now, do not assume the silence means absence. Some of the most powerful work is done in a whisper, in the quiet, in the hidden hours, when it seems like nothing at all is happening. And now we come to the 11th and final story of our journey. And it is, in a way, the story that all the others have been quietly building toward. Because everything we have walked through so far has been about what happens inside you. The weight lifted, the grip loosened, the control surrendered, the fog crossed, the storm stilled, the walls opened, the wounds redeemed, the smallness embraced, the waiting endured, the dead things raised. But none of that was ever meant to stay locked up inside one heart. The 11th story is about what happens when a healed life begins to overflow, when the peace you have received stops being something you merely hold and becomes something that pours out of you into the lives of everyone you touch. There is a beautiful pattern that runs through so many of the old accounts of provision, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It is the pattern of the small thing that becomes enough, and then more than enough, and then overflowing. There was a day when an enormous, hungry crowd had gathered with nothing to eat, and the only food anyone could find was the small lunch of a single boy, a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish, almost nothing against the size of the need. By every calculation, it was laughably insufficient. But that small offering was taken and given thanks for, and broken and shared, and somehow it stretched and stretched until the entire multitude had eaten and was full, with baskets of leftovers gathered up afterward. The miracle did not begin with abundance. It began with someone willing to hand over the little they had. There was a widow drowning in debt with nothing left in her house but a small jar of oil, and she was told to start pouring it into empty vessels and to borrow as many empty vessels as she could find. And the oil kept flowing, jar after jar after jar, and it did not stop until there were no more empty containers left to fill. The limit on the miracle was never the size of the oil. The limit was the number of empty vessels she was willing to bring. There was a poor woman who put 2 tiny coins into the offering, an amount so small that anyone watching would have overlooked it entirely. And yet that humble gift, given from genuine love rather than from overflow, was honored and remembered and spoken about for thousands of years afterward, far longer than the large gifts of the wealthy, who gave from their surplus. And there is one more scene from the 11th story that I cannot leave out, because it shows what overflow looks like even in the darkest possible place. There were 2 men thrown into the inner cell of a prison, their feet locked in chains, their backs wounded, the night around them as black as any night can be. And what did they do in that cell? They did not curse, and they did not despair. In the middle of the chains, in the middle of the darkness, at the darkest hour of the night, they began to sing. They lifted up songs of gratitude when there was nothing visible to be grateful for. And as they sang, the ground itself began to shake, the prison doors flew open, and the chains fell away. Do you understand what that means? Sometimes the breakthrough does not begin when the circumstances finally change. Sometimes the breakthrough begins the moment a heart decides to praise and to trust while the circumstances are still as dark as ever. The song came before the earthquake. The trust came before the doors opened. The overflow began on the inside, in chains, before anything changed on the outside. This is the destiny the 11th story holds out to you. You were never meant to be only a vessel that needs to be filled again and again, anxiously guarding the little you have. You were meant to become something more like a river, a channel through which life flows on its way to thirsty ground. When you have been healed of a deep wound, that healing was never meant to stop with you. It was meant to make you the kind of person who can sit with someone else in their wound, with a tenderness you could only have learned by going through your own. The words you speak begin to carry the breath of encouragement instead of the chill of bitterness. The small, ordinary kindnesses you offer, often without even realizing it, begin to plant seeds of hope in people who are quietly running on empty. A lamp is never lit to be hidden under a basket. It is lit to be set up high where it can give light to everyone in the house. And the light that has been kindled in you through everything you have survived was never only for you. It was lit so that others, stumbling through their own darkness, might find their way by it. So those are the 11 stories, 11 quiet doorways out of the same exhausting house of fear and control. But before we gather them all together and bring this journey to its close, I want to slow down with you for a little while longer, because there is a single thread running through every one of these stories. And if you can grasp that thread, you will be able to carry the whole journey with you, long after these words have ended. The thread is surrender, not the surrender of defeat, not the surrender of someone who has given up and stopped caring, but the deeper and braver surrender of someone who has finally decided to stop carrying alone what was never theirs to carry alone. Think of the young woman who was told that her entire life was about to change in a way that was beyond all reason and full of risk. She could have been misunderstood. She could have been judged and rejected by everyone around her. And no one would have blamed her for demanding answers first, for insisting on a guarantee, for trying to control the outcome before she agreed to anything. But instead she bowed her head and offered a quiet yes, a willingness to walk a road she could not yet see, and through that simple, trusting surrender, something the whole world had been waiting for came into being. The greatest things so often enter our lives not through our striving and our grasping, but through a heart that is willing to say yes before it can see the entire road ahead. Think of the man who stepped out of a boat in the middle of a stormy night and did the impossible, walking on water toward a figure he trusted. As long as his eyes stayed fixed on that figure, he did what should not have been possible. He walked across the very thing that was meant to swallow him. But the moment he looked down and around, the moment he turned his attention to the howling wind and the towering waves, fear rushed in and he began to sink. And here is the detail that matters most. When he began to sink, he was not abandoned to the water. A hand reached out at once and caught him and lifted him back up. The lesson is not that he should never have been afraid. The lesson is where the eyes go. When your gaze is fixed on the problem, on the future, on every terrible thing that could go wrong, your heart fills with the kind of fear that pulls you under. But when you lift your eyes back to the one who called you out onto the water in the first place, you remember that the same voice that called you is more than able to keep you from sinking. And even on the day you do sink, even on the day your faith fails and you go under, you are not left to drown. The hand is faster than your falling. Think of an entire people standing at the edge of a sea with an army closing in behind them, and no way forward and no way back. Every human calculation said they were trapped, that this was the end, that there was nothing to do but despair. But the way forward did not depend on there already being a road. It depended only on their willingness to trust and to move when the moment came. And the sea that had been a wall of impossibility became a corridor of deliverance, opening up exactly where there had been nothing but deep water and dread a moment before. Do not let the limits of your eyes decide what is possible for your life. The road you need does not have to already exist for you to be led safely across. Sometimes the path appears only after the first trembling step is taken. And think of those same people. Once they were through the sea and out in the wilderness, learning the hardest lesson of all, which was how to trust for today without hoarding for tomorrow. Each morning a strange and gentle provision appeared on the ground, enough to feed them for that day, and they were asked not to store up great piles of it for the future, but simply to gather what they needed for the day in front of them, and to trust that tomorrow's provision would come tomorrow. How much of our exhaustion comes precisely from trying to live tomorrow, and next month and next year all at once, today in a single overloaded heart? You were never asked to carry the whole future at once. You were only ever asked to receive enough for the day you are actually in, and to trust that when tomorrow comes, the provision for tomorrow will be there to meet you. There is a question that was once asked of a group of terrified people in the middle of a storm, and it is a question worth letting echo in your own heart tonight. The question was simply, why are you afraid? It was not asked coldly, as if the storm were not real or the danger were imaginary. It was asked tenderly, as a way of pointing them back to a truth they had forgotten in their panic, which was that the presence with them in the boat mattered more than the size of the storm outside it. And that same gentle question is being asked of you. Not to shame you for your fear, but to remind you that your fear has been measuring the wrong thing. You have been measuring the size of the storm. You were always meant to remember the one in the boat. There is something else woven through all of these stories that I do not want you to miss, and it is the quiet, steady fact of being known. One of the loneliest fears a person can carry is the fear of being forgotten, of being just one small and unremarkable face in a vast crowd of billions, of being overlooked by a world that is too busy and too large to notice whether you rise or fall. If you have ever felt that way, and most people have, then hold on to this. There is an old and tender image that speaks of a love that has engraved your very name on the palms of its hands, the way someone might write down the name of the person they cannot bear to forget. You are not lost somewhere in the anonymous multitude. To the eyes of the world, you may feel like a small and insignificant soul, but that is not the truest thing about you. You are known by name. Not a single tear you have cried in the dark has fallen unseen. Before the cry of your heart ever reached your own lips, it had already been heard. Before the first tear ever fell, the pain behind it had already been noticed. And the love that knows you does not rise and fall with your performance. This is so different from the love we are used to. Human love, even at its best, so often comes with conditions we can feel even when no one says them out loud. Be useful and you will be valued. Be strong and you will be kept. Stop being convenient and watch people drift away. Many of us have been left by someone the moment we were no longer strong enough, or productive enough, or pleasant enough to be worth the trouble. But the love at the heart of these stories does not work that way at all. When you stumble, it does not turn its face away from you. When you are weak, it does not withdraw its affection and wait for you to get your act together. It does the opposite. It grows more gentle toward the wounded, the way a parent does not abandon the child who has fallen and scraped both knees, but kneels down in the dirt and gathers the crying child up into their arms. There is a kind of love that has been called everlasting, a love from before you were born, and it is the kind of love that says you are wanted, not because of what you can give, but simply because you are. Remember the man who lost almost everything in a single devastating season. He lost his wealth. He lost those he loved most. He lost his health, and for a long time he lost even the peace within his own heart, until all he had left were ashes and 1,000 unanswered questions. There were moments when he sat in the dust with nothing to say but his grief, and yet he was never abandoned in those ashes. In time, what he had lost was not only restored but multiplied, given back to him in greater measure than before. But here's the part that matters most, the part most people miss. The greatest thing that was restored to him was not his cattle or his fortune or even his comfort. The greatest thing restored to him was a deeper knowing. Before the suffering, he had only heard about the divine from a distance, secondhand, as an idea. After the suffering, he knew it for himself intimately, as a presence he had touched in the very pit of his pain. There are some things, it turns out, that can only be learned in the dark, and a closeness that can only be found on the other side of a sorrow you would never have chosen. And notice, too, the kind of people who are pulled out of obscurity and given a place in these stories, because it tells you something about how worth is truly measured. There was a foreign widow with no status and no future, who through quiet faithfulness and loyalty found herself woven into a lineage of kings, given a place in a story far greater than the small and grieving life she thought she was living. There was an orphan girl, raised by a relative, who through a series of impossible turns became a queen positioned to save an entire people from destruction, placed exactly where she needed to be, for exactly the moment that needed her. There was a woman carrying so much shame that she came alone in the heat of the day to avoid the eyes of others, and yet she was met with such acceptance and such living hope that she ran back into the very town she had been hiding from and became the first to carry good news to an entire community. The pattern could not be clearer. The ones the world counts out are so often the very ones who are chosen, lifted and used, precisely so that everyone can see that the lifting was never about human greatness at all. It was about grace finding a willing heart in an unlikely place. Now I know that even after hearing all of this, a stubborn question may still be turning in the back of your mind, and it is a fair one. If I am so known and so loved and so chosen, then why has the thing I have been longing for taken so very long to come? Why the delay if I am truly held? And there is an answer to that question that is hard to receive but profoundly kind once you understand it. Sometimes a blessing is held back, not because it is being denied, but because the one who is meant to receive it is still being prepared to carry it. Imagine pouring a great and heavy treasure into a fragile vessel before the vessel has been strengthened. It would shatter under the weight. And so before the weight of a blessing is placed into your hands, the capacity of your soul is quietly being enlarged to hold it. You are being taught humility in the lean seasons so that you will not be destroyed by pride in the seasons of plenty. You are being taught to seek the giver before you seek the gift, so that when the gift finally arrives, it will not pull you away from the very source of your peace. If everything you ever wanted had been handed to you while your heart was still ruled by fear and grasping and anxiety, you would have clutched those blessings with trembling, fearful hands, terrified of losing them, and the gift itself would have become a new source of dread. So part of the waiting is mercy. Part of the delay is love taking the time to make you ready, so that when abundance comes, you will be able to hold it with gratitude instead of fear, and remember the one who gave it, instead of worshiping the gift in his place. And this matters all the more because of the kind of world we are living in, a world that is louder and more crowded and more restless than perhaps any world has ever been. We live among people who are running, almost all the time, chasing after a sense of worth in things that cannot hold worth for very long. They measure themselves by the attention of strangers, by numbers on a screen, by money, by status, by carefully arranged appearances that hide as much as they show. The glow of countless screens has become, for so many, a kind of substitute for the light they were really made for, and it leaves them more tired and more empty than before. People are connected to the entire planet, and yet feel more alone than ever. They laugh, and they post, and they perform, and then the night comes, and the noise dies down, and the old emptiness is still sitting there waiting for them. There is an ancient and piercing question that cuts straight through all of it, and it asks what it could possibly profit a person to gain the whole world and yet lose their own soul in the process. The greatest poverty is not the lack of money. The greatest poverty is a person who has forgotten that they were made for something deeper than the endless chase, made to belong, made to be loved, made to rest in something that does not slip through the fingers the moment it is grasped. And in the middle of all that noise, there are so many souls so worn down that they no longer even know how to hope. They keep getting up, they keep going to work, they keep smiling for the people who depend on them. But on the inside, they are carrying a quiet, hidden exhaustion that they have stopped trying to explain to anyone because they have decided that no one would understand and nothing would change. There are prayers they have prayed so many times into so much silence that they have begun to believe the silence is all there is. But remember what the 10th story taught us, that the deepest work is so often done in the quiet that the gentle whisper comes only after the wind and the earthquake and the fire have passed. If you are one of those tired and hidden souls tonight, then hear this gently. The silence you have been hearing is not the silence of absence. It may very well be the silence of something growing, something being prepared, something drawing nearer with every passing day that your weary eyes are simply not yet able to see. There is a truth underneath all of these stories that I want to set into your hands now, like something solid you can hold on the nights when everything else feels uncertain, and it is the truth of belonging. So much of our striving comes from a desperate, unspoken need to earn our place, to prove that we deserve to be here, to work hard enough that we will finally be allowed to rest. We live like servants who are terrified of being dismissed, always anxious, always trying to justify our existence by our usefulness. But you were never meant to live like a frightened servant. You were meant to live like a beloved child who already knows, deep in their bones, that their place at the table is secure and was never in question. A child does not lie awake at night, wondering whether they will be allowed to stay. A child sleeps peacefully, not because they understand everything happening in the house around them, but simply because they know they are home, and they know they are loved. That is the rest your soul has been aching for, not the rest that comes from finally finishing everything, because the list never finishes, but the rest that comes from knowing you belong before you have done anything at all to deserve it. And the value that belongs to you was settled long before you ever arrived. You are not an accident or an afterthought in the design of things. There is an old and staggering claim that you were known before you were ever formed, that your name was spoken before you ever learned to speak it yourself, that the days of your life had a shape and a purpose woven into them before the first of those days had even begun. People may have made you feel small. People may have told you, with their words or with their silence, that you were forgettable, that you were too much or not enough, that you would never amount to anything worth noticing. But those voices were never the final word over your life. There is a quieter and truer voice that sees in you what your own eyes have never been able to see, a light placed in you from the very beginning, a story your life is meant to become, a purpose that no amount of failure has the power to erase. And the same fire that you may have feared would destroy you has, all along, been refining you. There is a reason the old craftsman spoke of testing gold by fire. Real gold is not consumed by the flame. The flame only burns away the impurities, the things that were never truly part of the gold to begin with, and what is left when the fire has done its work is purer and brighter than what went in. The trials you have endured were never meant to destroy you. They were meant to burn away everything that was keeping you from becoming the truest and most luminous version of yourself. The very fact that you are still here, still breathing, still capable of lifting your eyes toward hope, after everything you have been through, is itself the evidence that the fire did not consume you. It refined you, you came through, and the one who carried you this far has made a promise that is worth more than any other promise in all these stories, the promise never to leave you and never to forsake you, not in the failure, not in the weakness, not in the long silence, not even in the hour when you have no words left to pray and can only lie there in the dark and breathe. So, what does all of this ask of you in the end? It asks for faith, but not the kind of faith you may have imagined. Faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is not a warm and pleasant feeling that arrives only when life is going well. Faith is far braver and far quieter than that. Faith is when your legs are still trembling and you take the next step anyway. Faith is when the tears are still wet on your face and you still lift your eyes upward. Faith is when you cannot see a single way out and you still choose to believe that a way is being made where your eyes can see no path at all. Faith is not a single dramatic moment of certainty. It is a daily decision made again every morning, often through gritted teeth, that says, even though I do not understand everything, even though I cannot see the whole road, I will keep walking, and I will keep trusting, and I will not turn back. It is the kind of thing the righteous have always lived by, this quiet, stubborn, daily choosing to trust when trusting is hard. And here is something that will reframe so much of your past if you let it. Look back for a moment at the doors that closed in your life, the ones that made you weep, the ones you begged to stay open, the ones whose closing felt like the cruelest thing that had ever happened to you. With the distance of time, how many of those closed doors turned out to be protection you could not recognize in the moment? How many of those endings spared you from a pain you never even saw coming? How many of the relationships that fell apart, the opportunities that slipped away, the plans that collapsed, were quietly steering you away from a deeper sorrow and toward a better path you could not yet imagine? The seasons of waiting that once made you so restless were maturing you, preparing you, deepening you, so that you would be ready to receive what was coming. Not a single one of your tears fell without being seen. Not a single one of your long nights passed without purpose. Even in the times you felt the most utterly lost, there was a hand quietly setting stone after stone along a path that was leading you, the whole time, back toward healing. And so I want to speak to you now, not only about the past you can finally make peace with, but about the season that is rising in front of you, because there is one. There is an old promise that runs through these stories like a current beneath the surface, and it speaks of new things springing up, of fresh life breaking through ground that looked barren, of streams appearing in the desert, and roads opening through the wilderness. And the most striking thing about that promise is its timing. It does not say that the new thing will come someday, far off, after enough suffering has been endured. It says, even now it is already beginning to spring up. The new season is not waiting for some distant future when you have finally earned it. It begins quietly, often before you can see it, while your eyes are still red from the old grief, and your hands are still empty of any proof that anything is changing. Roots are reaching down before the shoot ever breaks the surface. The new thing is already underway, but there is one enemy of this new season that I have to warn you about, because it is so quiet and so common that most people never even notice it is robbing them. That enemy is comparison. Nothing will steal the joy of your own unfolding story faster than constantly measuring it against someone else's. When you look too long and too closely at another person's journey, at the timeline you imagine they are on, at the blessings they seem to receive so easily, you forget that a completely unique story is being written for your life, one that cannot be copied from anyone else's and cannot be measured by anyone else's clock. Remember that the shepherd boy who faced the giant did not need to wear the king's heavy armor to win his battle. In fact, the borrowed armor would only have weighed him down. He had to fight as himself with the simple tools he actually knew how to use. The foreign widow did not need to pretend to be someone she was not in order to step into her unlikely destiny. The orphan who became a queen did not need to compete with anyone or claw her way to the front, because the moment she was made for came looking for her in its own time. What is truly meant for you cannot be stolen by another person, and you do not need to become a copy of someone else to walk into it. What opens for you within the right timing, no one can shut. What is yours will reach you in its season. So I am asking you to begin to live differently, starting tonight. Not with a heart braced for the next disappointment, but with a quiet expectancy that something good is moving toward you. Stop looking at your present circumstances only through the bruised eyes of old disappointments. Begin to look at them through the eyes of faith, which see not only what is, but what is becoming. Wake up in the morning with the awareness that you are not as alone or as forgotten as the fear has been telling you. There are encounters being arranged that you know nothing about yet. There are doors being prepared to open at exactly the right moment. There are answers being drawn closer to you, day after day, and miracles quietly forming in places your eyes cannot yet reach. But understand this, because it is the deepest part of the promise. The greatest thing that wants to be restored to you is not merely your outward circumstances. The greatest restoration is the restoration of your soul itself, the lifting of the anxious, watchful weariness, and the planting in its place of a heart that finally knows how to rest. Because when you learn to trust through the whole of the journey, something beautiful happens. You stop chasing only the gift, and you begin to treasure the one who gives. And that is exactly where the truest and most unshakable peace is born. There is one more image I want to give you before we come to the end, and it is the image of rain after a long drought. There is an old account of a man who climbed a mountain after years of dryness and prayed for rain while the sky stayed stubbornly empty, and he sent his servant to look toward the sea again and again, and again and again the report came back that there was nothing. But he kept praying, and at last the servant returned and said that there was a single small cloud rising over the water, no bigger than a man's hand. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing, almost not worth mentioning. But the man knew that tiny cloud was the first sign of an abundant rain that was already on its way. So if all you can see in your life right now is one small sign, one faint flicker of change, one little mercy that seems almost too small to count, do not despise it. Do not dismiss it. The first drop is not the whole rain, but it is the promise of the whole rain. What begins as a single small cloud can become a downpour that floods the dry ground and brings the whole withered land back to life. And so I ask you, in this quiet moment, to do the bravest thing of all. Open the hands you have been keeping closed because of fear. Open the heart that has grown so weary from defending itself for so long. You were not created merely to survive, to white-knuckle your way from one crisis to the next, guarding your small reserves and bracing for the worst. You were created to receive, and then to overflow, to become like a stream of living water flowing through dry and thirsty places, carrying life to people who had given up on the idea that life could ever reach them again. The blessing that is coming was never meant to stop with you. It was meant to flow through you, and the very wounds you were once so ashamed of will become, in time, the places where your light reaches others most powerfully, because people trust the comfort of someone who has actually been where they are, far more than they trust easy words from someone who has never suffered at all. Before we gather these stories together, I want to spend a little while longer on the one thing that has been quietly underneath every fear we have named tonight, because if you can see it clearly, it loses much of its power over you. That thing is the voice of fear itself, and the first thing you need to understand about it is that it is not the voice that was ever meant to guide your life. Fear has a particular way of speaking. It always whispers the same message in 100 different disguises, and the message is, you must save yourself. It tells you that if you are not constantly alert, disaster will surely find you. It tells you that if you ever let down your guard, even for a moment, you will be caught defenseless. It tells you that you have been forgotten, that no one is coming, that it is all on you, and it has always been all on you. And because fear speaks so urgently and so constantly, we mistake its loudness for wisdom. We start to believe that the anxiety is keeping us safe, that the worry is doing something useful, that if we just stay worried enough, we can somehow worry the danger away. But fear has never once changed an outcome. All it has ever done is rob the present of its peace and pay for nothing in return. The spirit you were truly given was never a spirit of fear. It was a spirit of strength and of love and of a calm and steady mind. And every time fear tries to convince you otherwise, it is lying to you in the voice of someone who only wants to keep you small. Consider the man who was thrown into a den of lions because he would not abandon what he believed. By every reasonable expectation, that was the end of him. The lions were real. The danger was real. The night in that den must have been the longest of his life. And yet when the morning came, he walked out unharmed, because the mouths of the lions had been held shut through the night. The danger did not vanish. He was not spared the den, but he was kept through it, carried through the very thing that should have destroyed him. And that is so often how it goes. You are not always lifted out of the frightening place, but you are kept within it, guarded in the middle of it, brought safely through to the other side of a night you were sure you would not survive. Or look at the small birds of the air, which do not plant or harvest or store food away in barns, and yet they are fed, morning after morning, season after season. Look at the wildflowers in the field, which do not labor or worry over what they will wear, and yet they are clothed in a beauty more delicate than the robes of kings. If such ordinary, fleeting things are cared for so faithfully, then how much more are you cared for? you who have lain awake at night, precisely because you matter so deeply? The invitation hidden in all of this is simple. Do not let your heart be taken captive by tomorrow. So much of our suffering is not even about today. It is about a tomorrow that has not arrived and may never arrive in the shape we fear. You were given enough strength for the day you are actually living, never for all the imagined days at once, and that was a mercy, not a lack. There is a kind of armor that most of us have been wearing for so long that we have forgotten we ever put it on, and I want to ask you gently to consider taking it off. We armor ourselves with control, believing that if we can just manage every detail, we will be safe. We armor ourselves with suspicion, holding everyone at a careful distance so that no one can get close enough to hurt us. We armor ourselves with the endless rehearsal of worst-case scenarios, as if by imagining every disaster in advance, we could rob it of its power to wound us. And we wear all of it convinced that it is protecting us, when in truth it is exhausting us, weighing us down, making us harder and lonelier, and more tired with every passing year. The armor of fear is heavy, and it does not actually keep the arrows out. There is a different kind of protection, and it does not feel like armor at all. It feels more like peace. It is the quiet, steady covering of a heart that has decided to trust, a mind clothed not in panic but in hope, a soul that has set down the heavy weapons of suspicion and taken up instead a calm assurance that it is held. You do not have to fight every battle in the straining of your own flesh. There are victories that are won not by your effort but by your surrender, not by gripping tighter but by finally, deliberately letting your hands fall open. Take off the armor that has been crushing you. You were never meant to carry that much weight into every ordinary day. And so there is an invitation at the very center of all of this, and it is the most tender invitation a tired person could ever receive. It is the invitation simply to come and rest. To everyone who is weary, to everyone who is carrying a load too heavy to name, the call is not, try harder, and it is not, fix yourself first, and it is not, come back when you have earned it. The call is, come and I will give you rest. You are invited to cast the whole crushing weight of your anxiety off your own shoulders and onto someone strong enough to carry it, not because your anxiety is shameful, but because you were genuinely never built to hold that much. There is a peace that has been described as surpassing all human understanding, a peace that does not make logical sense given everything you are facing, and yet settles over a trusting heart anyway, and stands guard over it like a sentry at the gate, keeping watch over your thoughts and your feelings, even when the circumstances have not changed at all. That is the rest your soul has been starving for, not the rest of a problem finally solved, but the rest of a burden finally handed over. And the strange and beautiful thing is that when you stop trying to hold everything in your own two hands, you begin for the first time to feel how strong and how gentle the hands really are that have been holding you the whole time. Hold on to this. What you have been calling an ending may very well be the place where a new chapter is about to begin. We are so quick to read the closing of one thing as the closing of everything, to assume that because a particular door has shut, the whole story is over. But the one who writes these stories has a long and faithful habit of beginning the most beautiful chapters in the exact place where the old chapters seem to fall apart. The patterns that have held you captive for years, the fears handed down to you, the habits of worry you learned so early, you cannot even remember learning them. The cage of reasoning you have been pacing for as long as you can recall, none of those have to be the final word over your life. You were not made to live curled up inside a cage of careful, fearful logic. You were made to spread your wings. And the wings only open when you finally dare to release the familiar branch you have been gripping out of fear, the very thing we learned from the eagle near the start of our journey. The author of your story is not finished writing. What looks to you like the last page is, so often only the turning of the page, and the next chapter, written in grace, is already beginning to take shape in places your eyes cannot yet see. There is a particular fear I have not yet named directly, and it deserves its own moment because it is one of the heaviest weights a person can carry. It is the fear that you have already missed your chance, that the answer you needed has come too late, that whatever was meant for you has passed you by while you were too broken or too slow or too afraid to reach for it. So let me tell you about a time when it truly did look too late. There were two sisters whose brother had fallen sick, and they sent word for help, and they waited, and the help did not come in time. Their brother died. By the time the one they had called for finally arrived, the brother had already been in the tomb for 4 days. 4 days, long enough that every last flicker of hope had been extinguished, long enough that morning had fully set in, long enough that even the most faithful heart had accepted that it was finished. And one of the sisters said exactly what you have probably thought in your own moments of despair. If you had only come sooner, this would not have happened. If only it had not taken so long, but it was precisely there, in the place where human hope had completely run out, in the place where everyone agreed it was far too late, that the greatest wonder of all was revealed. The stone was rolled away, and a voice called into the tomb, and the one who had been dead for 4 days walked out alive. Do you see what this is telling you? What you call too late is so often the exact moment chosen for power to be revealed, because a rescue that comes while there is still a little human hope left can always be explained away. A rescue that comes after all hope is gone can only be called a miracle. So, if you are sitting in the 4-day silence of something you have already grieved and given up on, do not be so sure it is over. Sometimes the delay is not the death of the promise. Sometimes the delay is the setting of the stage, and then there is the fear that may cut deeper than any other, the fear that you yourself are the problem, that you have failed too many times, that you have fallen so far and so often, that you have used up whatever grace might once have been available to you. If that is the weight on your heart tonight, then I need you to hear the story of a man who failed in the most public and painful way imaginable. He had promised with his whole chest that he would never abandon the one he loved, that he would stand by him no matter what, that he would die before he ever denied him. And then, in the cold and frightened hours of a single terrible night, he denied him not once but 3 times, swearing he had never even known him. And then he heard the sound that broke his heart, and he went out into the dark and wept bitterly, certain he had ruined everything beyond repair. Now imagine being that man in the days that followed, drowning in shame, replaying your failure over and over, convinced that you had disqualified yourself forever. But here is how the story actually ends. Not long after, by the shore in the early morning, he was met again, and he was not greeted with a list of his failures. He was not made to grovel or to recount every detail of his betrayal. He was simply asked 3 times gently, "Do you love me?" 3 questions to heal the 3 denials. And then, instead of being cast aside, he was entrusted with even greater responsibility than before, given a mission to care for others, restored not in spite of his brokenness, but right in the middle of it. That is how grace works. It does not wait for you to become someone who never falls. It meets you in the very place of your falling and begins quietly to write a new story over the ruins of the old one. Your worst failure is not the end of your usefulness. It may be the exact place where the truest part of your story begins. I want to say something too, to the part of you that is tired of the wilderness, the part that feels like you have been wandering in a dry and difficult season for so long that you have started to believe it is a punishment. It is worth remembering that some of the greatest lives were shaped not in the palace but in the wilderness, and not quickly. There was a man who spent 40 long years as a forgotten shepherd in the desert, years that surely felt like a waste, like a demotion, like a life that had peaked early and then trickled away into nothing. And yet, those 40 quiet years in the wilderness were the very years that softened him, that taught him patience and humility, that prepared him to one day lead an entire people out of slavery and through the sea. Had he been handed that responsibility in his impatient and impulsive youth, before the desert had done its slow work on him, he could never have carried it. The wilderness was not his punishment. It was his schoolroom. There was another, a young man anointed for a throne, while he was still only a shepherd boy, and yet he was not placed on that throne for years and years afterward. Instead, he spent long seasons being hunted, hiding in caves, misunderstood, on the run, waiting for a promise that seemed to recede further into the distance with every passing year. But it was in exactly those hard-hidden years that he learned to find his strength in something deeper than a crown, learned to sing through the darkness, learned to love the source of his life more than the position he had been promised. The wilderness was not wasted on him either. So if you are in a wilderness season right now, do not assume it means you have been abandoned or are being punished. The desert has always been one of the favorite classrooms, the place where the deepest character is quietly formed, far from the applause of the crowd, in preparation for something you cannot yet see. And through every one of these wilderness journeys, even when the people walking them could not feel it, there was a presence going ahead. There is an old account of a people led through a trackless desert, and how they were guided by a pillar of cloud during the heat of the day, and a pillar of fire through the cold and frightening dark of the night, so that they were never, not for 1 hour, left to find their own way alone. There were countless times they were certain they had been abandoned out there in the emptiness, and yet every single morning, without fail, the provision they needed appeared on the ground, fresh and sufficient, proof that they had not been forgotten after all. And this is the quiet, steady reality wrapped around your own life, though you so rarely sense it. There are battles being fought on your behalf that your eyes have never seen. There are traps that were quietly removed from your path before your feet ever reached them. There are dangers you were steered away from without ever knowing the danger was there. There are encounters you wrote off as random coincidence that were in fact arranged with great care. You have been guided far more and protected far more and accompanied far more than the fear has ever allowed you to believe. The hand has been on your life the whole time, even on the days you felt most alone. Now we have come near to the end of our journey together, and I want to gather all 11 of these stories into one place, the way you might gather separate threads and twist them into a single strong cord, because each of them was only ever one strand of one larger truth. Think back over where we have walked tonight. We began with the weight you were never meant to carry, and the simple, freeing realization that the world does not actually rest on your shoulders, that the sun rises without you, and the sea stays in its place without you, and your very breath is given to you without your effort. From there we walked into the house of the widow with her last handful of flour, and we learned that the miracle so often begins not in abundance, but in the trembling moment of letting go of the very last thing we were most afraid to release. We stood beside the king who faced an impossible army and discovered that some battles are won not by fighting harder but by becoming still, by admitting we do not know what to do, and by trusting that the outcome is being handled by hands greater than ours. Then we stepped onto the road in the fog and learned that faith only exists in the space we cannot see, that the eagle rises only when it lets go of the branch, that we are often given just enough light for the next single step. We went out onto the stormy sea and remembered that peace was never about our strength to calm the waves, but about the presence with us in the boat. We faced the walls around our own hearts, and saw with a kind of grief that the same walls that keep out the pain also keep out the healing. And we let the potter's hands and the refiner's fire remind us that the pressing and the burning are not the end of us, but the making of us. We followed a betrayed and forgotten young man from the bottom of a pit to the height of a palace, and we understood that what looks like a detour can be the only road to our true destiny, and that delay can be the very thing that prepares us to carry what is coming. We sat with the ones the world counted out, the stammerer and the shepherd boy and the frightened man hiding from his enemies, and the one who said he was too young, and we learned that we are never chosen for our impressiveness, but always for our willingness, that the smallest seed becomes the sheltering tree, and the smallest flame drives out the dark. We endured the long agony of waiting, and learned that the silence on the surface is so often the sound of roots going deep, that those who sow in tears will reap in joy, that the buried thing is not always the dead thing. We walked into the valley of dry bones, and into the life of the man who was changed in a single encounter, and we dared to believe that nothing is too far gone to be raised, that the awakening so often comes in a whisper rather than a roar. And finally, we watched the small offerings of ordinary people multiply into overflowing abundance, and we heard two prisoners singing in the dark until the chains fell off, and we understood that we were never meant only to be filled, but to become a river through which life flows on to others. 11 stories, and one thread running through every single one. The thread is this: you were never meant to do it alone, and you were never meant to do it by force. The exhausting life of control, of carrying everything, of bracing for every disaster, of clutching tightly to keep from losing, was never the life you were made for. The life you were made for is a life of trust, of open hands, of resting in a love that does not change with your performance and does not abandon you in your weakness and does not forget your name in the crowd. The greatest miracle these stories hold out to you is not, in the end, the changed circumstance, though changed circumstances do come. The greatest miracle is a changed heart, a soul that has finally, after all the striving, learned how to rest. And if you need one final reason to believe that what looks finished is not finished, consider the oldest and most powerful image of all, the image of a morning after the darkest night anyone could imagine. There was a tomb, sealed and silent, holding everything that hope had died for. By every measure, it was over. The story had ended in the worst possible way, and the people who had believed went home in the kind of grief that has no bottom. And then the morning came, and the stone was rolled away, and the tomb was empty, and what everyone was certain had ended forever turned out to be the doorway into something greater than anyone had dared to dream. That morning declared, once and for all, that endings are not always endings, that death does not always have the final word, that the very place that looked like the grave of every hope could become the birthplace of a hope that nothing could ever kill again. So when you look at the buried things in your own life, and you are sure they are gone for good, remember the empty tomb. Remember that the one who walked out of it has a long history of turning the place of the ending into the place of the beginning. And remember, too, that none of this is a story about a power that was alive once long ago and has since grown old and tired and distant. The same strength that opened the sea has not weakened with the centuries. The same love that fed the multitude has not run thin. The arm that lifted the forgotten out of the pit has not grown too short to reach you where you are sitting tonight. The God who moved in all of these old stories is described as being the same yesterday and today and forever, which means the stories were never meant to be admired from a distance like beautiful relics behind glass. They were meant to be doorways, showing you that the one who did all of this then is still doing it now, still healing, still restoring, still raising the dead things, still making a way where there is no way, still arranging the encounters, and opening the doors and answering the prayers you whispered into the dark when you were sure no one was listening. A miracle is not only a thing that happened in an ancient book. A miracle is happening right now. Every time a hopeless heart learns how to hope again, every time a shattered soul begins quietly to heal, every time someone who was certain they could not take one more step gets up in the morning and takes it anyway. So now I want to bring you back to where we began, to that hour of the night when the house is quiet and the mind will not rest and the long list of fears unrolls in the dark, because you are going to find yourself there again. I will not pretend that one journey through 11 stories will banish every sleepless hour for the rest of your life. The fear will come knocking again on some other night, the way it always does. But when it comes, I want you to remember that you have been somewhere tonight. I want you to remember the gardener who prunes not to destroy, but to strengthen, and the widow whose last handful of flour became enough for a famine, and the king who won the battle by being still. I want you to remember the eagle that rises only by letting go, and the presence in the boat that the storm could never overcome, and the walls around your heart that were keeping out the very healing you were aching for. I want you to remember the young man in the pit who was being prepared for the palace, and the unlikely ones who were chosen not for their strength but for their willingness, and the seed in the dark soil whose silence was only the sound of roots going deep. I want you to remember the dry bones that lived again, and the small offerings that overflowed, and the prisoners who sang until their chains fell off. And most of all, I want you to remember the single thread that ran through all of it, the truth that you are known by name, loved without condition, held without fail, and never ever asked to carry it all alone. So loosen your weary hands one more time tonight. Let the fears you have been gripping fall gently at your feet where they cannot reach back up and grab you. Let your heart learn again the thing it has been forgetting, which is how to rest. You do not have to understand everything in order to be safe. You do not have to see the whole road in order to take the next step. You do not have to be strong enough, or finished enough, or worthy enough, because none of those things were ever the price of being loved. You only have to stop running from the peace that has been held open in front of you all along, and let yourself walk into it, slowly, the way light walks into a room at dawn. You are more held than you feel. You are more known than you fear. You are more loved than you have ever let yourself believe. The night you are in is real, but it is not the end of your story, and it is not strong enough to put out the light that has been placed inside you. The morning is coming. It is already on its way, rising like a small cloud over the sea, gathering quietly while you sleep. And one day, when you finally stand in the middle of your own restored season and look back over the whole long road you have traveled, you will understand, with tears of wonder this time, instead of tears of grief, that not a single one of your steps was wasted, not a single one of your tears went unseen, and not a single dark night was ever allowed to pass without a more beautiful dawn being prepared just beyond it. So rest now, breathe slow. You are not carrying the world, you never were. And as long as you keep walking forward with an open and trusting heart, there will never be a darkness deep enough to swallow the light that lives in you. Rest now, beloved traveler. You are home and you are held, and the dawn is closer than you think.